Howdy, all of you delicious people. I'm here today to review Utopia from 2020. I say that because there is to be a other Utopia out there that seemingly is to also cover this story. And so really there is kind of a different kind of flavor of that other show when I accidentally just watched it and I found out that like the beginning of the show is to be some comic book where two guys are looking for the Utopia manuscript. A little bit different from this iteration, and so I really think the first time that you watch this, your brain is just like, "Buh!" There's so much going on, and there's so much like science behind things, and you're trying to figure out, okay, who the heck are these people? What is really going on here? And you're trying to decipher it all. Where I think a second viewing and a second time around, you can much more enjoy it and just be like, okay, I think I really grasp this story and can enjoy it a lot more. And I think also that the possible other Utopia show ends up possibly also helping you like this one a little bit more, maybe explains a little bit more. So, with that said, teeing it up, what is this show about? I would say that this show does have that kind of like mind thing where you're just like, ugh, like this is to be so like talking about these viruses and illnesses and a comic book that is to have supposedly predicted all of those, predicted SARS and Mars and Ebola, and they end up also talking about the Uganda leaves and the Uganda outbreak, and there's a whole bunch of deciphering in this one episode of what this comic book actually is. So let's go and talk about this a little bit more. Let's talk about the comic book. So we in this comic book are to have this scientist who is to be forced by the devil to come up with all of these illnesses. And this devil is to come to this scientist in a form of a bunny for whatever the heck reason. But it's a man that is to have a face of a bunny. So it's just kind of an odd approach. But I don't know. I like. We also have the scientist who is to eventually have a daughter called Jessica Hyde, which it seems that Jessica Hyde is to come out of this comic book and actually be a character that is to be put into this story. And she is going to explain to us eventually somewhere down the road, uh, like what has transpired within either the comic book or what is to be now her life. So we also get Rainn Wilson eventually later on in this show, because I saw trailers of this, and immediately what caught my attention originally was Rainn Wilson being on the show. And so I was like, ooh, like, what is this? Like, because I've seen Rainn Wilson in stuff like Super and The Office, of course. That's kind of the no-brainer thing to talk about. And so I was kind of interested because, and I've also seen him in on the Meg. Uh, but yes, like Rainn Wilson and John Cusack was my kind of real reason to want to watch this show, and then they don't come up right away because of course they don't. It's like a build to get to these characters because these characters will eventually be important somewhere down the road. So what is to be happening teeing up into this episode? Well, we eventually have a newly wedded couple who is to inherit a home that is to all of a sudden find a comic book that had gone out of print or had never shown the continuation of the dystopia story. And so now that this couple, who is in blissful ignorance about anything to do with this comic book, has never probably heard of it before, is to, because they just kind of inherited it from some random grandfather of theirs. And so they go on and they try to sell this comic book via this FringeCon, or FringeCon. There we go. And so we end up having these characters coming in who are to either be people that just want to decipher the comic book in many different kind of ways. And we also have a group that you see somewhat here, that is to be the main focus of this story, who want to decipher the comic book to figure out what possibly this comic book, this new one, could have predicted, and what diseases are to be going on into this comic book. Because we have other people that are just kind of going on and trying to figure out like what kind of karate that Jessica was to be involved in, and so on and so forth. So we have this group of people that are big fans of dystopia, and they are all to meet up in this this FringeCon, and they're to have some of them meet for the very first time, and some do have an attraction to the other, and some are to be really for us to find out like how really weird some of these characters are, finally, for them to meet up and find out how really weird or just paranoid a person is. But also there are certain characters that are just so happy-go-lucky that, like, hopefully we could just be able to figure out how to get this Utopia comic book and come up with a massive amount of cash. So going on into this story, I'm just going to go into spoilers because I've technically teed it up. Pretty interesting story from what I guess would just be the pilot episode. I think once I went into the pilot episode, like, I was just really interested in the whole like series, because I'm like, comic book. That immediately kind of fit my fancy. And we also have this story of Arby and a guy named Rod, who are also having their own side story in here to try and prevent anybody from ever looking inside the Utopian comic book. I think in the other variation of Utopia, we end up having guys coming in with some kind of inhaler kind of thing for people to inhale and then fall over and pass out. But it seems that in this version, we have Rod coming in and giving everyone needles, bizarrely. And so I was just kind of a little baffled or confused about the whole needle thing. So, but anyways, let's go into that double five. Let's otherwise go into spoiler time, because it's about that time yet again to go into spoiler time. It's about that time you get to spoil this episode. So, like I said, we have both Ethan and Olivia, who are to be this newly wedded couple that are to inherit a house from, I guess, a dead grandfather, I guess. So we go on and have this couple go and are to have Ethan be holding Olivia through to make it to be in their house. And so all of a sudden they go onto this house, they're thumbing through it, and Olivia is just telling Ethan to just dump everything. And so Ethan is starting to stroll through all of this stuff and like, man, this guy was a real hoarder. All of a sudden, Ethan is to stumble upon this unique comic book called Utopia, and he starts thumbing through the pages, and he's just like, ew, ew, this is gross. So, Ethan eventually is to show Olivia these pages, and she's just like, yeah, that's weird. So, Ethan is to go on and say, like, well, maybe this is a really unique comic book because it's a continued thing from a story called Dystopia. And so we have Ethan who's thinking, well, maybe there is some big, massive fan base of this, and maybe we can see if we can turn out a big chunk of change from this, because Ethan is to go and talk about this story that some guy was to go on and find in his walls some really expensive comic books, because there had been this one story about a guy who used, I guess, comic books as insulation for a home, and they were to eventually find out that there was some really high-end comic books in the walls of this guy's house, and I think the one he ended up taking out was a really expensive one. uh, Possibly, like, the story changes, so I could say, like, oh, he found this blah 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 comic book, and surefire enough it probably will be a different comic book altogether. Like, I think I heard, like, maybe Green Lantern comic books, like the original, like, Green Lantern comic books, which is very rare to find, but then again, yeah, I don't know, that's a very rare thing to, like, super rare to find. So I don't know, could have been a number of things. So Ethan is to go on to Google and find out, like, yeah, like, this is going to be a huge thing for a fan base of people. So I guess they are to release out into the internet that there, of course, is to be an existence of a continuation of Dystopia. And so all of a sudden, we end up having Samantha, who's to be this landscaper, that is to go on and find out about this. And she ends up going and creating a group text to all of her friends that are to be big fans of Dystopia, and are to possibly want to go not only to this fringe con, but then want to see about buying this comic book, because supposedly there is going to be bids to eventually go on and buy this book. And funny enough, we end up having these people asking specifics about either the story or any number of things, and we just have Ethan and Olivia that are completely oblivious about any of it. They're just like, hey man, like, just, you get to see one page of the comic book and then give us your name and your number, and, like, we'll see how high the bids get. So, like I said, so Samantha is to be this landscaper, and she's all excited about this Utopia book being discovered. And so she goes on and group texts a lot of her friends. We end up having Ethan, who I guess is some Gap insurance salesman that is to go on and like, ask people if they are to get Lyme disease. And so we have this guy going on and trying to like figure out people's ailments that they ache and whatever. And all of a sudden, Ian is to get a text about the Utopian comic book. And he's like, "Oh my god!" While he's kind of on this call. So we have Wilson, who is to be a germaphobe, paranoid character, and so he is, of course, going on and being in a room with a girl named Monica, and he is to go on and talk about all these diseases and talk about dystopia, and so he ends up getting a text about the whole thing, and he's really excited, and so he ends up going to his father to ask his father for $30 for bus fare, and his father is, of course, telling Wilson, it's like, wait a minute, so you're gonna probably spend $30 from me for bus fare, but you're gonna probably turn around and go to this convention and drop $200 on a comic book? Like, does that make sense? But we have Wilson's father that's like, you know what? Like, you gotta see what uh, that crazed rabbit is doing. So, like, go ahead and go. So we have Becky, who is to go on and find about this whole information, and it seems that Becky and Ian are to finally meet one another because it seems like both them are to be like people that are to eventually be a couple at some point. Like there's some potential there for them to quickly fall in love once they go and finally meet one another for the first time and tell one another the truth about themselves. And so we have another character who is called Grant, who is to lie through his teeth about who he actually is, because he's telling this group that he's like, hey guys, yeah, I'm a guy that's to be this photographer for the stars, and I have this Porsche, and I'm the richest guy out of this whole group. But we end up finding out that Grant is just some kid, and reasonably he's just living at some home that probably no one would care if he disappeared, sadly enough. So, and then we have, but let's, Becky. Becky, we end up finding out once she is to get news about this whole thing, and we have kind of Samantha, or we kind of have certain people in the chat mentioning if Becky and Ian are finally going to meet, and so on and so forth. So we have us find out that Becky is to have, for some reason or another, seizures. It seems that Becky is to go on and pour this glass of water out to one of her plants. Then all of a sudden she starts to fall over and have a seizure. She goes and starts grabbing medication, but then she like hooks herself into this chair and is just kind of waiting out this seizure. And I'm like, oh my god, like this woman could probably die at any time. But it doesn't seem at any point that they go on and say what this illness actually is. Like she just has seizures, and that's all that they really say here. So now that I got that out of the way, because I was like, oh, let's get back to Becky. So we have Arby and we have Rod. Arby weirdly just has this thing for raisins. For some reason, he just always has these little boxes of these raisins, and he's eating them, and we have Arby that is getting uh, picked up by a guy named Rod, who is to seemingly have this massive yellow bag at the back of his car, which is really just identical to the other Utopian show's yellow bag, as if they tried to get the exact same identical one. So, this yellow bag is to have, of course, uh, a thing filled with needles that is to have poison inside of it. If not that, a gun of sorts to kind of wield to go and kill numerous people, because we'll get to that. So Arby is talking about that he didn't want to be late, and Rob is just like, well, hey, like we're gonna make it there in plenty of time, like let's go. So because if anything right now, like I'm just waiting on you, so let's go. So we now go on to have Samantha talking to her dad. And so we end up having uh, Samantha kind of having a conversation with her dad about uh, this book and just talking about certain illnesses and whatever. And so Samantha eventually goes on to make it to this Comic Con or this Fringe Con. So she ends up making there, and she's starting to see the weird and wildness of all these people who are to seem to also be fans of this dystopia. So we also have everybody slowly but surely starting to arrive here. And so Ian is to be the first one at this bar that they are supposed to meet up at. And Ian is consistently asking for a girl named Becky. And so once Ian finally does eventually make his way to finding Becky, Ian has already ordered this drink that he's kind of a little bit like demasculated by ordering. And so Becky ends up arriving, and he's like, "Oh, Becky." And they're like, "Yeah." So both Ian and Becky are now alone, and so we have Ian who's kind of just sad about his drink because Becky is just to order a beer. And I'm like, you couldn't have said what the name of it was? Like, you just said a beer? Like, I don't know how many bartenders would just be like, what beer? What kind of beer? Because, like, that wouldn't just be, like, a trigger to just say, like, oh, just get her a random beer. No, like, those places don't usually work like that. But we all of a sudden have Becky taking Ian's drink and deciding that she wants to drink that. And so instead, Ian's just like, well, hey, like, I'll take that drink then, like, make that too. So Becky and Ian go on, and they're telling each other their true life story. And so Ian is saying that he is to, of course, be working in Gap Insurance, and that he's talking to people about Lyme disease all day long. And so we eventually have Ian wanting to know, of course, Becky's secret, Becky's life. And it seems that Becky isn't exactly all that into telling Ian her life story quite yet. But it seems that Becky is like, well, it's really good to like see you. Like we had to wait a whole year for this to actually happen, And Ian's like, well, I would have waited too. And so eventually both Becky and Ian kiss here. I'm like, okay, like it seems that like it's good that these characters actually do, once they find out about one another, technically they finally do like kiss or whatever. You would have thought like, oh, we're starting out all from the beginning again, because now once we've like met one another, the slate is all reset and it's all clean, and now we're gonna have to refigure one another out again, because that's usually what happens through every single time that you are to go on and talk to somebody through the internet. All of a sudden, once you turn around and you meet them in person, all of a sudden everything is so awkward and different and whatever that you have to go on and like uh, start from zero and work your way back up. So we have Samantha going on to finding a bunch of guys that are going on and talking about the comic book, but they're talking about it in a way that Samantha does not like. Because we have the guys trying to theoretically figure out what of course karate that Jessica Hyde had been into, jujitsu or some other kind of karate of sorts. And Samantha's like, you know what? I don't like you kind of guys that have to go through and like figure out like this story of things, when I would much rather figure out like the diseases and the secrets in the comic book. And the guys in the costumes are just like, oh, you're one of those. Ugh. So Samantha goes on and is to see this one page, and she is to mention about a Uganda leaf that is to, of course, be a showcasing of the Uganda outbreak. And we have Wilson who is going and listening to Samantha talk about all this. And Wilson is kind of following what she's saying, and Wilson is just like, yeah, like that, like that's how you should see this comic book and not the way they see it. And so Wilson is just kind of agreeing on with what Samantha is saying, and even chiming in at some point also. So it seems that Wilson has now found Samantha, and so now they're going on to the bar to meet the rest of the people. And so Ian is to go on and spot Wilson because it's like, okay, this looks like that guy. Funny enough, we have none of these people that probably have like chat rooms or whatever, or like nobody has ever, I guess, sent a picture of who any of these people look like. But Wilson is to want a background check of all these characters before he is to go on to let them be, of course, anywhere near his home, because he doesn't really trust them all that well. So once the group finally meets up together and they all sit down, with the exclusion of Grant, who of course is to be some kid who eventually comes into the convention later, we eventually have Wilson going on and mentioning some past things that these people had gone on to do. Wilson is to make fun of Samantha for going to some Maroon 5 concert, and Wilson is making fun of Ian for doing some fan fiction thing. And we also have Becky, who Wilson just says, it's like, well, like, you're just as nice as you seem. Until. So, we have it where all of these people have all gone on to meet with, of course, Olivia and Ethan, and gone on to try and look at a page of Utopia, because they're only able to look at one page. So we have Ian, who had taken a picture of one of the pages without Ethan like seeing it. We had Becky, who was to go on and ask about like what kind of diseases or what kind of things were in store for this comic book, and Ethan didn't have the answer for this. Samantha was going on and asking what the highest bid for this comic book is, and Samantha was to say that she could probably get them $6,000 because the highest bid supposedly at that point was supposedly $5,000. But we all of a sudden have a guy come in, a guy that is to, of course, be in the penthouse, and I believe his name is Carson, Philip Carson. And Philip Carson is to come in to this place and is to mention, hey, you know what, I want to leave with this comic book right here and now, and I'll give you guys $20,000 for it to close up shop here. And Ethan and Olivia are just like, oh my god, like this guy is just made of money. And so the guys are just like, heck yeah, because that's nowhere near the bids that anybody else is saying. So they go on and they quickly give away this comic book to this guy who is to supposedly be in the penthouse. So all of a sudden, finally, Grant is to show up. This little kid is to show up in this room asking for this comic book, as a number of weird and goofy characters have also come in to look at this comic book that eventually have weird and or strange names, like Star Weaver, or Artemis Dude, or Jessica Hyde Dude, Scientist Dad, Shitty Evil Rabbit, sure, Ankler Man, Harvest Dude, and the list goes on and on. So we go on and we have Grant, who is to ask about the comic book, and Olivia is to tell him, hey, sorry kid, the comic book is already sold. If you go into the penthouse where Philip Carson is at, like, you can go ahead and find him. So Grant is, of course, to go to the head desk and mention to them, oh, hey, yeah, like, my dad, like, isn't in his room, and I lost the key to the room, and, like, I need your help trying to, like, get me to get into this room. And so the woman at the head desk is telling Grant, it's like, yeah, like, normally I would go on to ask for ID here, but you're a little kid. And so Grant is like, well, hey, yeah, like, the only thing that I have is ID is just this. It's some weird, like, name plate of a thing that just says Grant Carson. And so this girl is just like, here you go, kid. So Grant goes into the penthouse and is turning on, like, the TV and turning on some kind of music, and he's just kind of enjoying his penthouse breaking his, or what is the perfect word? Sneaking his way in here, coming up with a good enough story. So Grant goes on and is to eventually find the comic book, and it's in some kind of like sealed, see-through kind of book of things. And so Grant is now like, yeah, I have this comic book, and I'm going to put it in my backpack, and yeah, like, I am just going to take this book. So all of a sudden, Grant is to realize that Philip is coming back with some cosplayed girl, and Grant is now kind of like hiding away beside this bed. So now we have Arby and we have Rob that is to also make their way to Olivia and Ethan's room talking about Utopia. And so they go on and they tell these guys, it's like, well, hey, like, I'm sorry, like, we just, like, we sold a comic book, and they have a whole entire list of all the people who are to have seen this comic book, and also that they know that Philip Carson is to, of course, have the comic book in his penthouse room. So they now go on and they threaten these people by gunpoint or whatever that, hey, like, we're gonna go and we're gonna knock all you guys out, and we're going to inject you with a needle to just kind of have you guys pass out. We're gonna take all your money from you, and but we're gonna leave you alive. So all of these people start to be terrified because they don't really know if what they're really telling them is true. And I would be like, I'm sorry, I would go on and try to defend myself here because I don't trust that they're going to leave me alive. Because why wouldn't they just punch me in the face and knock me out that way? So this guy goes on and is to kind of wipe certain arms and start putting needles into people's arms, and they end up start dropping like flies one by one. We have both Ethan and Olivia who are getting so scared that that Ethan is telling Olivia that he loves her, and so we go on, and all these people are to drop like flies. But here is the goofy thing. So these people are to be poisoned and killed in this room. Obviously, Olivia is to say that they were poisoned, and so here's the weird thing. They poison these people now, but Arby just goes through and finds everyone else in their rooms and starts one by one shooting them and murdering them. And I'm like, why not shoot all the people? What is the point of the needle? That makes no real legitimate sense. If you're gonna do one thing to kill a bunch of people, consistently do it. Like, if you're gonna needle those people, why not needle everybody? That makes no sense. Like, I get that there's probably an easier way to just shoot a person and then go off to the next thing and shoot the, like, I know that the needle part probably does take a long time, but you could have just shot everybody. What's the difference here? So we eventually have Arby and Rob who make it to the penthouse room and go on to shoot both this cosplayer and Philip. They go on and they stab Philip into the hand, and they're asking him where, of course, the comic book is. Where is the Utopia manuscript? And so he doesn't give them the answer, but Arby and Rob end up seeing Grant, who's running away from this hotel room. And so now they're like, oh, okay, we're going to have to do a number of things. We're going to have to knock out all the video footage from all of these floors. We're going to have to go and figure out where this kid went. And we're also going to have to figure out all the people, where they live, and try to kill them also. Basically, all the people of this group here, Ian, Becky, Samantha, Wilson, because they weren't, I guess, going to actually be in the hotel. They were going to go off to eventually make their way to Wilson's place so they can spend the time there, and then eventually make their way back to where they actually live after X amount of days. So we have Jessica Hyde, who is to also appear in the Ethan and Olivia uh, hotel room. And so, and here's the funny thing. I'm kind of interested in how all these people could conveniently get a apartment for a convention, because usually when there's a convention that rolls around, usually the convention places are so jam packed with people that it's severely hard for anybody to get a room unless they're like booked like a year in advance or like ridiculously far in advance, and then you'd also have to guarantee that you could get a Comic-Con thing. So it's just like, yeah, how could you guarantee all of this? But I guess it's just convenient for a story, right? So Jessica is to go on to speak to Olivia, who is the only one left alive. And so all Jessica Hyde cares about is where is Utopia. And Olivia is to give her a card with Philip Carson's name on it. And of course, Jessica Hyde again is like, well, where is Utopia? And we have, uh, of course, Olivia asking, well, why? And Jessica is to go on and say, it's like, well, I'm Jessica Hyde. That's why. That's why I'm asking. And that's how the episode is to, of course, end. So, with that said, yeah, really interesting story. Hopefully, I covered most of this episode. I kind of like went like through and covered most of the kind of the bullet point stuff. I know there was some stuff that I didn't exactly cover or was thinking I was going to cover and then probably forgot about it. Um, but I think if I probably would have originally done this and reviewed this originally, I think I would have left a lot more out. Just because I don't have the perfect ability to have found certain things that I did this time around. So, with that said, yeah, it's kind of a fun show. I really enjoy it, and if people are to be interested in me talking about Utopia, I will continue to do so. But if there isn't any interest, then this is just a one-off thing that I did for one day. Just because I really wanted to do something different and also something easy. So, Utopia, I'm going to get out of here. Goodbye, everybody. Bye, everybody.